They called it the Steel Curtain. Lieutenant Takeshi Kusaka had heard the phrase whispered among the replacement pilots at Tainan Air Base in the summer of 1944, but he dismissed it as defeatist talk from men who had lost their nerve. Kusaka was 22 years old, a graduate of the Tsuchiura Naval Air Corps with 130 hours of flight time. He could execute a textbook torpedo run, maintain formation through weather that grounded lesser pilots, and land his Nakajima B6N Tenzan on a carrier deck in moderate seas. By the standards of the Imperial Japanese Navy in mid-1944, this made him a fully qualified combat aviator. On the morning of June 20th, 1944, approximately 120 miles west of Guam, Kusaka sat in his cockpit waiting for the launch order. His aircraft carrier, the Hio, pitched gently in the swells. Around him, 47 other aircraft were being positioned for takeoff: dive bombers, torpedo, bombers, and fighters. This was the second wave of strikes against the American carrier task force that had been detected the previous day. The first wave, launched at dawn, had not yet returned. Kusaka checked his instruments for the third time. Oil pressure nominal, fuel tanks full, torpedo armed and secured in its ventral cradle. The Type 91 aerial torpedo weighed 1,800 pounds and carried 450 pounds of high explosive. At the proper release altitude of 60 to 100 feet, travelling at 160 knots, the torpedo would enter the water cleanly, stabilize, and run toward its target at 42 knots. Kusaka had practiced this attack profile 23 times during training. He had never missed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The flag dropped. The first aircraft began its takeoff roll. Kusaka watched. It lumber down the deck, gain speed, and claw into the air. One by one, the strike force lifted off. When his turn came, Kusaka advanced the throttle and felt his Tenzan surge forward. The deck blurred beneath him. The island superstructure flashed past on his right. Then he was airborne, climbing into the humid tropical air, banking to join the formation. The strike leader, a veteran lieutenant commander with combat experience dating back to the Dutch East Indies campaign, waggled his wings and turned northwest. 48 aircraft followed him toward the American fleet. They flew in loose formation at 8,000 feet. Below them stretched the empty Pacific, broken only by occasional whitecaps. The sky was clear, except for scattered cumulus clouds at 12,000 feet. Perfect flying weather, perfect attack weather. Kusaka had been told what to expect. The American carriers would have fighter patrols, but those could be dealt with by the Zeros providing escort. The carriers themselves would have anti-aircraft guns, certainly, but nothing his aircraft could not penetrate. The key was to press the attack with determination, to bore in through the defensive fire, to release the torpedo at the precise moment when geometry and speed aligned. Every pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy had been trained to accept that some aircraft would be lost in any attack. But the majority would survive, would deliver their weapons, and would return to tell of American carriers burning and sinking beneath them. This was what Kusaka believed as he flew northwest on the morning of June 20th, 1944. This was what every pilot in the strike force believed. They were wrong, and they were about to discover exactly how wrong in a manner so devastating that it would fundamentally alter Japanese naval aviation doctrine for the remainder of the war. Not that it would matter by then. To understand what Lieutenant Kusaka and his fellow pilots believed possible, it is necessary to return to December 7th, 1941, and the attack that had defined Japanese naval aviation's self-conception for the 3 years that followed. On that morning, 183 aircraft from 6 carriers had approached Pearl Harbor in the first wave. The American defenders had been caught almost entirely unprepared. Anti-aircraft fire had been sporadic, uncoordinated, and largely ineffective. Of the 183 attacking aircraft, 9 had been lost, a loss rate of less than 5%. The torpedo bombers, the Nakajima B6N Tenzan, had been particularly successful. They had approached from multiple directions, flying low over the water at exactly the altitude and speed their pilots had practiced for months. The American battleships, moored in neat rows along Battleship Row, had presented textbook targets. The battleship Oklahoma had capsized after taking multiple torpedo hits. The West Virginia had settled to the harbor bottom. The California had flooded and listed heavily. The Nevada had attempted to get underway and had been deliberately beached to prevent her from sinking in the channel. The Arizona had exploded catastrophically when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, though that had been a dive bomber's achievement, not a torpedo plane's. The pilots who executed these attacks had been the elite of Japanese naval aviation. They had trained for years, accumulating flight hours that would have been considered exceptional by any nation's standards. The average Japanese carrier pilot in December 1941 had logged between 600 and 800 flight hours. Some veterans had over 1,000. They had practiced their attacks until they could execute them under any conditions, in any weather, against moving or stationary targets. More importantly, they had developed a doctrine based on their experiences. The Japanese Naval Air Arm believed that a determined attack, pressed home with proper technique and sufficient courage, would always succeed. Individual aircraft might be lost to defensive fire, but the formation as a whole would penetrate, would deliver its weapons, and would achieve its objective. This was not blind faith. It was a conclusion drawn from actual combat experience in China, where Japanese aircraft had operated for years against minimal opposition, and from the spectacular success at Pearl Harbor. The pattern had repeated in the months that followed. In February 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft had struck Darwin, Australia. The defenders had scrambled fighters and manned anti-aircraft batteries, but the result had been the same. Japanese losses had been minimal. Damage to Allied shipping and facilities had been severe. In April 1942, the Indian Ocean raids had sent British warships fleeing and demonstrated Japanese reach across thousands of miles of ocean. The carrier Hermes had been sunk. The cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall had gone to the bottom. British aircraft had barely scratched the attacking forces. Even the battles that had gone less favourably had reinforced certain assumptions. At the Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese aircraft had sunk the carrier Lexington and damaged the Yorktown. Japanese losses had been heavy, yes, but the attacks had succeeded. The American carriers had proven vulnerable. At Midway in June 1942, the disaster that had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers had been attributed to bad luck, poor timing, and tactical errors, not to any fundamental inadequacy in Japanese aircraft or pilot skill. The American dive bombers had caught the Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft. That was the explanation that circulated through the Naval Air Corps. Better reconnaissance, better timing, and the outcome would have been different. This was the operational reality that shaped Japanese naval aviation training and doctrine through 1943 and into 1944. Pilots learned to fly their aircraft competently, to navigate over open ocean, to recognize ship silhouettes, to execute attack runs. But as the war ground on and Japan's most experienced pilots were lost in combat or to operational accidents, the training pipeline began to produce aviators who were, by pre-war standards, barely qualified. By early 1944, new pilots might have as little as 100 hours total flight time before being assigned to operational squadrons. While Japanese naval aviation was consuming its veteran pilots and replacing them with inadequately trained replacements, the United States Navy was constructing something unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. It was not a single weapon system. It was not a tactical innovation. It was an integrated defensive network that combined radar detection, fighter direction, massed automatic weapons, proximity-fused ammunition, and fire control systems, into a layered defense that would prove nearly impenetrable to conventional torpedo and dive bombing attacks. The foundation of this system was radar. By 1943, every American carrier and most escort vessels carried air search radar capable of detecting incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The SC and SK series radars mounted on carriers could pick up large formations at distances that gave defenders 30 to 40 minutes warning. This was time enough to launch additional fighters, position ships for maximum defensive firepower, and prepare gun crews for action. Fighter direction had become a science. Each carrier task force now included dedicated combat information centers, cramped spaces deep in the ship where radar operators, plotters, and fighter direction officers coordinated the defensive response. When enemy aircraft were detected, fighters were vectored to intercept using radio communication that allowed controllers to guide them directly to the threat. The F-6F Hellcat, introduced in 1943, was fast enough, tough enough, and numerous enough to establish air superiority over any battle space where American carriers operated. By mid-1944, the typical fighter sweep would destroy or drive off a significant portion of any attacking formation before it even reached visual range of the task force. But it was the anti-aircraft armament itself that represented the true revolution. In 1941, an American carrier might have carried a dozen 5-inch guns and perhaps 24 smaller caliber weapons, mostly older .5-inch machine guns. By 1944, the Essex-class carriers that formed the backbone of the fast carrier task forces carried 12 5-inch guns in twin mounts, between 44 and 52 40mm Bofors guns in quad mounts, and up to 55 20mm Oerlikon guns in single mounts. This was not counting the escorts, the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that surrounded each carrier and added their own weapons to the defensive barrage. The Bofors 40mm gun was a Swedish design that had been adopted by multiple nations, but the Americans had refined its employment to an extraordinary degree. Each quad mount was served by an 11-man crew. The gunner sat in the center, controlling elevation and traverse with power assists that allowed him to track fast-moving aircraft smoothly. The 4 loaders worked in pairs, feeding 4 round clips into each of the 4 barrels in a continuous rhythm. A well-trained crew could sustain a rate of fire of 160 rounds per minute from all 4 barrels combined. The effective range was approximately 5,000 yards against aircraft. The explosive shells, each weighing just under 2 pounds, would detonate on contact or when their tracer element burned out, creating a cloud of shrapnel lethal to aircraft structures and crew. The 20mm Oerlikon was lighter, simpler, and even faster firing. A single gunner operated each weapon, swinging it on a simple pedestal mount. The rate of fire was 450 rounds per minute. The effective range was shorter than the Bofors, only about 2,000 yards, but within that range, the volume of fire was extraordinary. Oerlikons were positioned all around the ship's superstructure and flight deck edges, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach angle. The 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns had been the standard American heavy anti-aircraft weapon since before the war, but by 1944 they had been transformed by a technological development that bordered on the revolutionary. The VT fuse, proximity fuse, was a miniaturized radar system built into the nose of each shell. As the shell approached an aircraft, the radar detected the target's presence and detonated the 55-pound warhead at the optimal distance to create a lethal fragmentation pattern. Before the proximity fuse, anti-aircraft fire required either a direct hit or precise timing to explode the shell at the target's altitude. With the proximity fuse, accuracy requirements were dramatically reduced. A shell passing within 70 feet of an aircraft would likely destroy it. The defensive firepower available to an American carrier task force by June 1944 represented an escalation in anti-aircraft capability that had no precedent in naval warfare. To understand what Japanese pilots were about to encounter, it is necessary to consider the actual numbers, the physical reality of what hundreds of automatic weapons firing simultaneously could produce. A typical fast carrier task force in mid-1944 consisted of 4 to 5 Essex-class carriers, supplemented by several light carriers of the Independence class. Surrounding these carriers were 2 to 4 fast battleships of the Iowa or South Dakota classes, 3 to 4 heavy cruisers, perhaps a dozen light cruisers and anti-aircraft cruisers, and upward of 20 destroyers. Each of these ships contributed to the defensive barrage. Consider a single Essex-class carrier, 12 5-inch guns, usually firing proximity-fused shells at a rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun, 11 quad 40mm Bofors mounts, each mount firing 160 rounds per minute. 52 20mm Oerlikon guns, each firing 450 rounds per minute. If every gun on a single carrier fired at maximum sustained rate, the ship would be putting approximately 26,000 rounds into the air every minute. That was one carrier. A task group built around 4 carriers, with their escorts all firing, could theoretically produce over 100,000 rounds per minute. The sky would not be empty space, punctuated by occasional shell bursts. It would be a solid volume of explosive projectiles, tracer rounds, and fragmenting metal through which any aircraft would have to fly. The crews manning these weapons had been trained to standards that would have seemed excessive in peacetime. American gunnery schools put recruits through weeks of intensive instruction. They learned to track fast-moving sleeves towed by aircraft. They practiced loading drills until they could maintain maximum rate of fire for extended periods without jamming. They memorized lead angles for targets at different speeds and altitudes. They learned to work as teams, with loaders, trainers, and gunners functioning as a single coordinated unit. More importantly, they had ammunition in quantities that Japanese logistics officers would have found incomprehensible. An Essex-class carrier might carry 36,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition and over 100,000 rounds of 20mm. The escorts carried proportional loads. There was no need for fire discipline in the sense of conserving ammunition. When enemy aircraft appeared, the standing order was simple: fire until the threat was destroyed or driven off. Ammunition expenditure was a concern for the supply officers back at port, not for the gunners in combat. The fire control systems tying these weapons together represented another layer of technological superiority. The Mark 37 Director, mounted high on the superstructure of carriers and major combatants, was a sophisticated electromechanical computer that calculated lead angles, predicted target movement, and directed the 5-inch guns to the optimal firing solution. Radar provided continuous range and bearing data. Human operators fine-tuned the solution based on visual observation. The guns themselves were aimed and fired by remote control from the director, ensuring that all guns in a battery tracked the same target and fired in coordinated salvos. The Bofors quad mounts, while not centrally directed, used simpler but still effective lead computing sights. The gunner placed the target aircraft in the sight, matched its speed with a rate control, and the sight automatically calculated the lead angle. He simply had to keep the target centered in the sight picture and fire continuously. The system was not perfect, but it was far more effective than eyeball aiming. Even the Oerlikon guns, operated by a single gunner with no computing sight, benefited from improved training and doctrine. Gunners were taught to fire in short bursts while tracking the target, walking their fire onto the aircraft rather than trying to hit with a single perfectly aimed shot. The high rate of fire meant that even mediocre accuracy would put multiple rounds into the target if the gunner kept firing. Japanese intelligence had some awareness that American anti-aircraft defenses had improved. Pilots who survived early encounters with American task forces reported heavy and accurate fire. But the reports were fragmentary, often from pilots who had been focused on their attack run and had limited ability to assess the overall defensive system. The full scope of what the Americans had constructed was not appreciated by Japanese Naval Aviation Command. More fundamentally, there was no response available, even if the threat had been fully understood. Japan's aircraft industry could not produce radar systems compact enough for widespread shipboard installation. Japanese fire control systems remained largely manual. Training time for pilots and gun crews had been compressed by the demands of attrition warfare. The industrial capacity to manufacture millions of rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition and distribute it across the Pacific did not exist. Japanese doctrine had no answer to the American defensive system except to press attacks with greater determination and accept higher losses. There was discussion of different attack approaches, of coordinating strikes more carefully, of concentrating force against single targets. But these were tactical, adjustments to a strategic problem. The fundamental imbalance could not be corrected through better tactics. Lieutenant Kusaka first saw the American fleet at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, on June 20th, 1944. The strike force had been flying northwest for over an hour. Fuel was becoming a concern. The Tenzan's tanks held enough for perhaps another 90 minutes of flight time. If they did not locate the American carriers soon, some aircraft would have to ditch in the ocean on the return flight. Then the clouds ahead thinned, and there they were. Ships spread across miles of ocean. Carriers, large and small. Battleships with their distinctive profiles. Cruisers and destroyers arranged in protective circles around the capital ships. Kusaka counted at least 15 major combatants in his visual range, and he knew there were more beyond the horizon. This was the American Mobile Fleet, Task Force 58, the most powerful naval formation ever, assembled in the Pacific. The strike leader waggled his wings and began deploying the formation for attack. The fighters would go in first to suppress defensive fire and draw off the American Combat Air Patrol. The dive bombers would attack from altitude, forcing the carriers to maneuver. The torpedo bombers, Kusaka's unit, would come in low from multiple directions, timing their attacks to arrive when the carriers were distracted by the dive bombers overhead. Kusaka pushed his stick forward and began his descent. Around him, the other torpedo bombers followed. They dropped from 8,000 feet to 2,000 feet, then to 500 feet, then lower still, until they were barely 100 feet above the wave tops. At this altitude, the Americans' radar would have difficulty tracking them until they were quite close. The torpedo bombers accelerated to attack speed, 160 knots. Ahead, Kusaka could see one of the carriers beginning to turn. Black smoke poured from her funnel as she increased speed. Around her, the escorts were maneuvering into defensive positions. And then, the sky began to fill with fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It started as small black puffs appearing in the air ahead of the formation. 5-inch shells with proximity fuses, detonating in precisely calculated patterns. Kusaka saw one explode perhaps 200 feet in front of him and slightly to the right. The shell burst created a dark cloud of fragments that remained suspended for a moment before dissipating. Then there were more bursts, dozens of them, filling the airspace through which the torpedo bombers had to fly. The first aircraft was hit 30 seconds after the barrage began. The Tenzan to Kusaka's left suddenly pitched upward, its tail section torn open by shell fragments. The pilot fought for control, but the damage was catastrophic. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged into the ocean, creating a white splash that was visible for perhaps 3 seconds before the sea closed over it. More aircraft were hit. Kusaka saw one lose its entire port wing to a direct hit from a 5-inch shell. The aircraft tumbled out of formation, spinning wildly, and crashed into the water. Another took fragments through the engine cowling, and oil began streaming back across the windscreen. The pilot pulled up, trying to gain altitude, but the engine seized, and the propeller stopped turning. Without power, the Tenzan was simply a glider with very poor gliding characteristics. It descended in a shallow spiral and ditched hard, breaking apart on impact. The formation had closed to approximately 3 miles from the nearest carrier when the 40mm fire began. This was different from the 5-inch barrage. The Bofors shells were smaller, but there were so many more of them. Kusaka could see the tracers, bright lines of light, that seemed to come from every ship simultaneously. The tracers were only every 5th round. For each tracer he could see, there were 4 more rounds he could not see, all converging on the space his aircraft occupied. The sound was extraordinary. Through the engine noise and the slipstream, Kusaka could hear the impacts, metal striking metal, not occasional hits but a continuous hammering as shells found their target. His aircraft shuddered. Something struck the vertical stabilizer, and the Tenzan yawed to the left. He compensated with rudder, but the controls felt mushy, uncertain. To his right, another aircraft simply disintegrated. A concentrated burst of 40mm fire, perhaps 20 or 30 rounds in 2 seconds, hit the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The aircraft broke in half. The forward section, with the pilot still inside, tumbled forward and down. The rear section, with the torpedo still attached, fell separately. Neither part hit the water intact. Kusaka was down to 2 miles from the carrier. This was when he should begin his final attack run, lining up for the torpedo drop. But the formation had ceased to exist as an organized unit. Aircraft were scattered across miles of ocean, some still attempting to press the attack, others trying to evade the defensive fire, still others simply falling from the sky. There was no coordinated assault, no mutual support, no timing. Each pilot was alone, trying to survive long enough to release his weapon. At 1 mile from the target carrier, the 20mm fire began. This was the final defensive layer, the last wall through which an attacking aircraft had to pass. The Oerlikon guns on the carrier's deck and superstructure opened up in a sustained roar that blended into a single continuous sound. The tracers filled the air so densely that they seemed to form solid streams of light rather than individual projectiles. Kusaka's aircraft was hit repeatedly. He felt each impact through the control, stick, through the seat, through the rudder pedals. Something struck the canopy frame and shattered, sending fragments into the cockpit. A piece of metal hit his left arm, tearing through his flight suit and cutting deep into the muscle. He barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the carrier ahead, on holding the aircraft steady for the torpedo drop. The torpedo bomber to his left exploded. Not a gradual destruction from accumulated damage, but an instantaneous detonation that consumed the entire aircraft. The 40mm shells had found the torpedo's warhead. 450 pounds of high explosive detonated, vaporizing the aircraft and its crew. The shockwave hit Kusaka's Tenzan like a physical blow, shoving it sideways through the air. He fought the controls, got the nose back on target. 600 yards. This was the optimal release range. Any closer, and the torpedo might not have time to stabilize after water entry. Any farther and the carrier's evasive. Maneuvers would make a hit unlikely. Kusaka reached for the torpedo release lever, a red handle mounted on the left side of the cockpit. His arm responded slowly. He looked down and saw blood covering his sleeve, running down to his gloved hand. The wound was deeper than he had thought. 500 yards. The carrier was turning hard to port, presenting its narrow stern aspect. This was the worst possible angle for a torpedo attack. The target width was minimal. The wake created turbulence that might deflect the torpedo. But there was no time to reposition, no opportunity to set up a better attack. Kusaka pulled the release lever. Nothing happened. He pulled again, harder. The lever moved through its full travel, but he felt no change in the aircraft's handling, no lightening as 1,800 pounds of torpedo fell away. He glanced at the indicator panel. The release mechanism had not functioned. The torpedo was still attached. 400 yards. The carrier's 20mm guns were firing directly at him now, a focused concentration of fire from perhaps 20 weapons. The Tenzan shook continuously from hits. The windscreen shattered, and wind roared into the cockpit. Kusaka pulled back on the stick, trying to gain altitude, trying to climb over the carrier and escape on the other side. The engine failed. Not a gradual loss of power, but an immediate cessation. The propeller continued to windmill from the aircraft's forward motion, but it was producing no thrust. Something critical in the engine had been destroyed. Fuel line, oil line, control linkage, it did not matter which. The result was the same. Without power, the Tenzan began to sink. Kusaka pushed the stick forward, trying to maintain airspeed. If he could glide past the carrier, he might be able to ditch in the water beyond the task force. It was unlikely he would survive ditching with the torpedo still attached, but it was the only option remaining. He almost made it. The Tenzan passed, directly over the carrier's stern at an altitude of perhaps 50 feet. Kusaka could see men on the deck, could see the gun crews tracking him, still firing. Then a final burst of 20mm fire, probably from one of the destroyers beyond the carrier, hit the Tenzan's port wing root. The wing folded upward, the structural spar severed. The aircraft rolled, inverted, and fell. Kusaka had perhaps 2 seconds of consciousness after the impact. The water was shockingly cold. The aircraft was sinking rapidly, cockpit flooding. He tried to release his harness, but his wounded arm would not respond, and his right arm could not reach the release mechanism. The water covered his head. He took an involuntary breath, inhaling seawater. Then there was nothing. Of the 48 aircraft in the strike wave that Lieutenant Kusaka had launched with that morning, 42 were destroyed. 4 returned to their carriers so heavily damaged that they were pushed overboard after landing to clear the flight deck. 2 returned intact, both fighters that had turned back early with engine trouble and had never reached the American fleet. Not a single torpedo hit was scored. Not a single bomb hit. The Americans had shot down 42 aircraft in approximately 20 minutes of combat and had suffered no damage to any ship in the task force. This pattern repeated throughout the day. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Japanese naval aviation effectively destroyed as a fighting force. In 2 days of air battles, Japan lost 373 carrier aircraft and approximately 300 land-based aircraft. American losses were 30 aircraft in combat and another 49 to operational causes, mostly aircraft that ran out of fuel returning from strikes and had to ditch. The disparity was not the result of superior Japanese courage failing against superior American courage. It was not. Tactics versus tactics. It was an industrial-age military power with integrated defensive systems, massed automatic weapons, advanced fire control, and proximity-fused ammunition against a force still attempting to execute attacks designed for an earlier era. The Japanese pilots were not cowards. They pressed their attacks with desperate bravery, but bravery without adequate equipment, without proper training, and without any realistic chance of success is simply another form of death. The few Japanese pilots who survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea and made it back to their carriers brought with them something more devastating than battle damage. They brought the truth. In the ready rooms and briefing spaces aboard the surviving Japanese carriers, these pilots described what they had encountered, not with the clinical detachment of an after-action report, but with the haunted voices of men who had witnessed something that fundamentally violated their understanding of modern warfare. One pilot, a dive bomber veteran who had survived attacks on both American and British ships earlier in the war, told his squadron mates that the defensive fire had been unlike anything he had previously experienced. At Coral Sea, at the raids on Ceylon, even at Midway, there had been anti-aircraft fire, certainly, but it had been survivable. A skilled pilot with proper evasive maneuvers could penetrate the defensive screen and deliver his weapon. What he had encountered on June 20th was different, not in degree, but in kind. The sky had not contained defensive fire. The sky had been defensive fire. There was no path through it, no gap in the barrage, no moment when the guns fell silent. Another pilot described watching his wingman's aircraft absorb what must have been 50 or 60 hits in the space of perhaps 10 seconds. The aircraft had not caught fire. It had not exploded. It had simply come apart, structural integrity destroyed by the accumulated damage of dozens of TARM, explosive shells. Wing panels had separated from the fuselage. Control surfaces had torn away. The aircraft had transitioned from a flying machine to falling debris, while the pilot was still strapped inside, still trying to control something that no longer existed as a coherent whole. A fighter pilot reported that the American Combat Air Patrol had been more numerous, better coordinated, and more aggressively vectored than in any previous engagement. The F-6F Hellcats had appeared in formations of 8 to 12 aircraft, directed by radio to intercept the Japanese strike groups while they were still miles from the task force. The Japanese fighters had been forced to engage these interceptors, using fuel and ammunition, before they could even attempt to suppress the ship-based anti-aircraft fire. By the time the torpedo bombers and dive bombers reached the American fleet, they had no fighter escort. They had gone in alone. The testimony was consistent across all survivors. The Americans had constructed a defensive system that conventional torpedo and dive bombing attacks could not penetrate. Not could not easily penetrate, or could penetrate only with heavy losses. Could not penetrate at all. The mathematics were unforgiving. An aircraft entering the defensive envelope of an American carrier task force in mid-1944 had perhaps a 10% chance of surviving long enough to release its weapon. If it released its weapon, it had perhaps a 5% chance of scoring a hit, given the carrier's evasive maneuvers and the difficulty of aiming while under continuous fire. If it scored a hit, it had effectively zero chance of surviving to return to its own carrier. These numbers meant that a successful attack required expending 10 aircraft per hit, achieved, and hits did not guarantee the target's destruction. Japan did not have 10 aircraft to expend per hit. Japan did not have the trained pilots to fly those aircraft. Japan did not have the industrial capacity to replace the losses. The mathematics of attrition were as unforgiving as the mathematics of anti-aircraft fire. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The remaining carriers had aircraft, but they had very few experienced pilots. Training programs could not produce replacements fast enough to offset losses, and the quality of training had degraded to the point where new pilots were barely capable of basic flight operations, much less combat. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to those Japanese officers who were willing to see them clearly. Without effective carrier aviation, the combined fleet could not project power across the Pacific. Without the ability to project power, Japan could not defend its perimeter. Without a defensible perimeter, the American advance would continue until it reached the home islands. The war was lost. Everything that followed would be simply the extended process of Japan's defeat, purchased at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, but with the outcome no longer in doubt. In the months following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese Naval Aviation Command faced an impossible task. They needed to develop tactics that would allow their remaining aircraft and pilots to attack American carrier task forces with some reasonable chance of success. But the fundamental problem was that no such tactics existed. The American defensive system was not something that could be overcome through cleverness or determination. It was an industrial and technological barrier that required industrial and technological solutions Japan did not possess. The response was the kaiten, the oka, and ultimately, the kamikaze. These were not innovations born of military genius, they were acknowledgements of failure. If conventional attacks could not penetrate American defenses because the aircraft were destroyed before, releasing their weapons, then the solution was to make the aircraft itself the weapon. The pilot would aim his plane directly at the target and dive into it, ensuring that the aircraft's fuel and any bombs it carried would detonate on impact. The defensive fire would still destroy most attacking aircraft, but some percentage would get through, and those that did would guarantee damage to the target. The kamikaze doctrine represented the complete abandonment of the principles that had guided Japanese naval aviation since its inception. Trained pilots were no longer valuable assets to be preserved and employed efficiently. They were expendable munitions to be expended in single-use attacks. Aircraft were no longer reusable platforms for delivering weapons. They were flying bombs that accomplished their mission by being destroyed. The entire structure of carrier operations, of training programs, of tactical doctrine, was inverted. Success was now measured not by how many aircraft returned but by how many aircraft successfully crashed into enemy ships. American naval officers who studied these tactics after the war noted their essential desperation. The kamikaze was not a superior form of warfare. It was an admission that Japan had lost the conventional air war and had no path to victory except through suicide attacks that might inflict enough damage to make the American advance prohibitively costly. This was the calculus of a losing power. If we cannot win, perhaps we can make victory so expensive that the enemy will negotiate rather than pay the price. The calculus was wrong. The United States Navy responded to kamikaze attacks by adding more anti-aircraft guns to its ships, by improving fighter direction procedures, by increasing combat air patrol strength, and by accepting that some damage was inevitable but could be sustained. American industrial capacity could replace damaged ships faster than kamikaze attacks could sink them. American personnel, replacement systems could train new sailors faster than kamikaze attacks could kill them. The war would continue until Japan was defeated, regardless of cost. But for individual Japanese pilots, The kamikaze doctrine meant something more personal and more final. It meant that their training, their skill, their experience was now irrelevant. A minimally trained pilot in an obsolete aircraft could execute a kamikaze attack as effectively as a veteran in a modern fighter, provided he could reach the target. The only skill required was the ability to take off, navigate to the target area, and aim the aircraft at a ship. Everything else, evasive maneuvers, formation, flying, attack technique, instrument flight, was unnecessary for a man who would not be returning. Young men who had joined naval aviation, imagining themselves as elite pilots, as warriors who would decide the outcome of battles through skill and courage, found themselves instead serving as guided missiles. Their role was not to fight but to die, and to die in a manner that would inflict maximum damage. Some embraced this role out of genuine belief in the cause. Some accepted it as their duty. Some went with profound reluctance, seeing no alternative in a society that offered no path for conscientious objection or refusal. The historical record contains examples of all three responses, though wartime censorship and post-war reticence means the full emotional reality of the kamikaze pilots remains partially obscured. What is not obscured is the result. Kamikaze attacks sank dozens of American ships and damaged hundreds more. They killed thousands of American sailors. They caused genuine concern among American naval commanders and real fear among sailors who had to endure them. But they did not alter the war's trajectory. They did not force negotiations. They did not prevent American carriers from operating wherever they chose. They were, in the end, a tragic waste of life that accomplished nothing except to extend slightly the duration of a war whose outcome had already been determined. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, and specifically the annihilation of Japanese carrier air groups on June 20, 1944, represented a dividing line in the Pacific War. Before that date, it was possible for Japanese military leaders to believe that some combination of superior fighting spirit, tactical innovation, and favorable circumstances might yet produce a decisive victory. After that date, such beliefs required willful blindness to observable reality. The material and technological superiority of the United States forces was no longer a matter of degree but of kind. For American sailors who manned the anti-aircraft guns during that battle and subsequent engagements, the experience was complex. There was satisfaction in the effectiveness of their weapons. Certainly. Gun crews took pride in shooting down attacking aircraft, in protecting their ships and shipmates. But there was also a recognition, at least among some, that what they were participating in was not combat between equals, but industrial-scale destruction of an enemy who no longer had the means to fight effectively. One gunner aboard the carrier, Essex, later wrote in a letter home that after the first hour of the battle, shooting down Japanese aircraft had begun to feel less like warfare and more like target practice. The enemy planes kept coming, kept attempting their attacks, but the outcome was never in doubt. He described feeling a strange mixture of emotions: relief that American defenses were so effective, pity for the Japanese pilots who died in such numbers, and a kind of disturbed fascination with the sheer scale of the destruction. In 30 minutes of action, he estimated his gun crew had fired over 3,000 rounds and had participated in the destruction of at least a dozen aircraft. The barrels of the 40mm guns had been so hot that water poured on them for cooling had flashed instantly to steam. The technological and industrial lessons of the battle were absorbed into American naval doctrine and would influence carrier design and operations for decades. The principle that carriers required layered defensive systems combining fighter interception, long-range guns with advanced fire control, medium-range automatic weapons, and short-range rapid-fire guns became foundational. The recognition that air defense was as important as offensive capability shaped carrier task force composition through the Cold War and beyond. For Japan, the lessons were learned too late to matter. The industrial base that might have produced equivalent defensive systems did not exist and could not be created under wartime conditions. The training infrastructure that might have produced pilots capable of adapting to the new defensive reality had been consumed by years of attrition. The strategic position that might have allowed Japan to avoid battle until more favorable conditions developed, had been surrendered through earlier decisions to expand the war's scope beyond what Japanese resources could sustain. Lieutenant Takeshi Kusaka did not survive to see any of these lessons learned or applied. His body was never recovered from the ocean west of Guam. He was 22 years old. He had 130 hours of flight time. He had trained to execute torpedo attacks against ship targets and had practiced his technique 23 times. He had never missed in practice. In combat, he did not survive long enough to release his weapon. His aircraft was destroyed by defensive fire from ships equipped with anti-aircraft systems that represented the peak of industrial-age warfare, systems against which his training and his tactics had no counter. His story, repeated across hundreds of other Japanese pilots in that battle and in the battles that followed, illustrates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Individual courage, skill, and determination matter, but they matter within the context of material realities. When those material realities create an insurmountable gap, no amount of courage bridges it. The Japanese pilots who attacked American carrier task forces in mid-1944 were not cowards, they were not incompetent, they were not lacking in fighting spirit. They were attempting to execute a form of warfare that the enemy's industrial and technological base had rendered obsolete. The steel curtain that Lieutenant Kusaka and his fellow pilots encountered on June 20, 1944, was not a metaphor. It was the literal reality of hundreds of guns firing thousands of rounds per minute, creating a volume of fire through which aircraft could not pass. That some pilots attempted to pass through it anyway, knowing the odds, speaks to their courage. That they failed, repeatedly and catastrophically, speaks to the futility of courage without adequate material support. War is not decided solely by the bravery of those who fight it. War is decided by industrial capacity, by technological advantage, by logistical systems, by training infrastructure, and by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. In all of these dimensions, by mid-1944, the United States held advantages that Japan could not overcome. The Battle of the Philippine Sea simply made that truth impossible to deny. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.